Here we will take a look at biogeochemical cycles. We have the water cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and sulfur cycle. So we'll briefly look at each of these. These cycles show the flow of some of these important elements and compounds in ecosystems. First, we'll look at the water cycle. This image shows how much of water on Earth is freshwater compared to saltwater. So only about 2.5% of water is freshwater, and some of that freshwater isn't even very accessible to living organisms. We want to focus on some of the major processes here, not all of the details. We see water exists in the atmosphere, we also see it in the ocean, rivers, and lakes, and we also see some here on the surface of soil and underground in groundwater. There will be a constant exchange of water between these sources. Water leaving the ocean, entering into the atmosphere, can do it through sublimation that we see right here. We also have evapotranspiration and evaporation. Evaporation would be water evaporating off these surfaces. Evapotranspiration is typically when water leaves plants. They essentially have little holes in the surfaces of their leaves for gas exchange. But when they do that gas exchange, some of the water that's inside the plant gets lost through those openings. So that is evapotranspiration. We obviously also have water coming back down from the atmosphere through precipitation. And then we can also see water going underground, and we can see it going from the ground back into rivers, lakes, and the ocean. If we think about the carbon cycle, we have carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere, and then we also have carbon in most of the organic compounds that make up our bodies. So proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, they're all carbon-based molecules. So all of the things that we build these bodies from has a lot of carbon in it. And the way that carbon gets from the atmosphere into those organic compounds is through photosynthesis. So plants take in CO2 and they create these organic compounds, and then the way it gets back into the atmosphere is the respiration of these organisms. So you and I breathe out carbon dioxide, and the respiration that plants also do releases that carbon dioxide back up into the atmosphere. Those are some of our main pathways. And over here, we're just seeing more of the same. They're just saying that photosynthesis and respiration can happen over here in the marine system as well. Another way that we can get carbon released in the atmosphere is through volcanic action and weathering of rocks and soil. Keep in mind, we also down here in the soil will have decomposition and respiration by microbes that's also releasing some carbon dioxide. The nitrogen cycle is processed primarily by bacteria. In the atmosphere, nitrogen is in its gaseous form. In the water and soil, it is typically in the form of nitrous oxides. You see the nitrogen and the oxygen there. So those are nitrous oxides. So the main conversion is when we go from nitrous oxides to nitrogen gas, we call that denitrification. And there are certain bacteria that do that. Then we go from nitrogen gas back into these forms that can be used, the nitrous oxides. This is nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen has to be fixed before it can be used by other organisms. Primarily, we're looking at the interplay between nitrogen fixation and then denitrification. When we look at the phosphorus cycle, most phosphorus is going to exist as phosphate ions. These phosphate ions can be aerosolized into the atmosphere through volcanic action. That phosphate can dissolve in oceans and streams. It can also be dissolved in soil. Plants, of course, can take up that phosphate, put that into their bodies, and make that available for other organisms in the food web. This image shows us a concept known as dead zones. Dead zones are areas where there's massive die-off of organisms because there's very little oxygen available in those waterways. A lot of phosphorus and nitrogen from fertilizers and other activities run into these waterways. It gets collected from rivers and streams, and it goes into these waterways, and it comes into these coastal areas. When the phosphorus and nitrogen level gets very high, it causes a massive growth of microorganisms. This bloom of microorganisms can do a variety of things. It can deplete the oxygen for other organisms. It also can reduce the amount of light that gets down into the water. And when you reduce the light that's coming in through water, you also reduce the rate of photosynthesis. And remember, photosynthesis is putting oxygen back into that water, so that further depletes the oxygen. So these dead zones are very concerning. Next, we have the sulfur cycle. Similar to nitrogen, we see sulfur existing as some of these oxides here, and then we also have hydrogen sulfide. It is primarily in the atmosphere as sulfur dioxide that then will become dissolved in waterways, will go into the soil, and then it will decompose in the soil and then back up into the atmosphere. As we said with nitrogen, plants in the soil can take up that sulfur and introduce that into the food chains. So it gives us a very brief look at the biogeochemical cycles.